About History series, The War Between the Qing and the Ming Zheng Dynasties.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into a literal 30-year geopolitical thriller. We're talking about an intense, high-stakes chess match between the Qing Dynasty and the Zheng family over the island of Taiwan. And understanding this incredibly tense standoff is absolutely crucial if we want to see how deep-rooted ideology and the sheer human cost of war really shape our history. So we're going to set up the board today. We'll look at the grand strategies, the devastating policies on the ground, and the deeply complex figures pulling the strings behind what was, for sure, a masterclass in strategic maneuvering.
Okay, let's dive right into this. 30. That is the grueling, exhausting number of years this standoff lasted. I mean, think about that. Starting way back with negotiations in Anping during the 10th year of Emperor Xinji, these two powers sat down for over 10 distinct rounds of peace talks, and every single one of them failed. Just totally fell apart. So you have to ask yourself, why? Why couldn't they just reach an agreement?
That brings us to Section 1, 30 years of stalemate, and the ideological barrier that caused it. So, the crucial point is that this 3-decade deadlock wasn't just a basic disagreement over, lines on a map. Not at all. It was rooted in a profound ideological barrier that neither side was willing to cross. We're talking about political identity, literally symbolized by something as simple as hair. The Qing demand was strict and, honestly, pretty unforgiving. Shave your head or lose your head. To them, the Q was the ultimate non-negotiable marker of political submission. On the flip side, Zheng Jing's demand was Yuan Zhao Xian Li. Now, actually, let me clarify something here. This wasn't a demand for Korean-style independence, which is how some people have misunderstood it. It really meant preserving Ming Dynasty customs and Han cultural identity, specifically keeping their traditional clothing and their hair intact. For the Zheng side, these peace talks were really just another battlefield.
Moving on to Section 2, the devastating coastal evacuation. Let's look at the human cost. We really need to shift our tone here for a moment, because the human cost of this political chess match, the collateral damage inflicted on the mainland, was just staggering. In August of the 18th year of Shunji, the Qing enacted what was known as the Boundary Order, or Chenji, and this was an extreme scorched earth policy. The goal? To ban all sea access and literally starve out the Zheng regime. To do this, 5 once wealthy coastal provinces, stretching all the way from Shandong down to Guangdong, were forcefully evacuated. They were turned into complete, desolate no-man's lands. Trade was entirely forbidden. Even fishing was strictly banned. The records say rough, unremarkable boundary stones marked the ruins of thousands of villages and the exile of countless refugees. When you picture those details, the history becomes terrifyingly real, doesn't it? They actually dug boundary trenches along the coast, and if anyone at all, was caught crossing them, they were killed on the spot. Everyday peasants were forced to abandon their fertile ancestral homes, and the ones who survived and relocated inland? Well, they were burdened with the massive, exhausting task of feeding and supplying the massive Qing armies stationed there to guard the empty coast. Let's move to and see how this builds, because suddenly the strategic board cracks wide open. In the 12th year of Kangxi, the massive Three Feudatories rebellion breaks out on the mainland. Sensing a huge opportunity, Zheng Jing launches a massive counterattack right into Fujian, which sparks a 6-year period of intense, bloody warfare. But the Qing ultimately prevailed. By the 20th year of Kangxi, the rebellion was completely suppressed. And now, you have a mature 27-year-old Emperor Kangxi finally able to turn his undivided focus across the sea to settle this Taiwan issue once and for all. Which leads us perfectly into Section 3, internal collapse and crisis. Because while Kangxi was consolidating his power on the mainland, something entirely different was happening across the strait. And it's a tragic irony, really. The Zheng regime was ultimately hollowed out not by Qing cannons, but by their own devastating internal decay. After that big mainland defeat we just talked about, Zheng Jing completely lost his fighting spirit. He just gave up. He retreated into alcohol and excess, eventually drinking himself to death by March 1681. He was only 39 years old. And this happened just a year after his most trusted, capable official, Chen Yonghua, passed away in deep depression, having lost his power and retreated to the lakes of Chishanbao. So without its key leaders, the Zheng regime just goes into an absolute freefall. I mean, look at the overwhelming scale of this collapse. 6 years of mainland war had completely emptied their treasury. To compensate, they slapped heavy taxes on the people, which immediately led to boiling public resentment. On top of that, as if things weren't bad enough, They suffered 3 consecutive years of floods, droughts, and severe famine. That was followed by massive, destructive fires in the densely populated areas of Qikhan and Anping. And then came the absolute final blow, an internal coup. A power-hungry official named Feng Zifan used vicious politics, rather than the sword, to seize control. He literally forced the rightful heir, Zheng Jing, to commit suicide and then installed a 12-year-old puppet ruler, Zheng Kexuang. It was total chaos. This brings us to Section 4, the search for command.
Over on the mainland, Fujian Governor Yao Qisheng senses this critical weakness across the strait, and he petitions the Qing court, urging an immediate attack. This triggers Emperor Kangxi's urgent search for the right military masterminds to actually lead this naval invasion. Kangxi's initial choice was his trusted Navy commander, Wan Zhengxi, but there was a massive problem. Despite all his past successes, Wan Zhengxi was entirely paralyzed by the fear of crossing the sea and having to face the renowned Jing general, Liu Guoxuan. He actually backed down. He refused to go, which created this desperate vacuum for leadership right when Kangxi needed it most.
Which brings us to the number 13. That is the agonizing number of years a forgotten general named Shi Lang spent benched in Beijing. Ever since 1668, he had been sidelined, just acting as a minor official, routinely mocked and ignored by the Manchus. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the dramatic irony of Shi Lang's exile. It's just incredible. While he was sidelined, literally to the point where his wife had to sell her own jewelry just so they could afford to buy food, Shi Lang never stopped preparing. For 13 long years, he obsessively drew and studied strategic maps of Taiwan. Whenever guests came over, he would passionately explain exactly how the island should be attacked. He reportedly wept openly over the suffering of his home province of Fujian during the rebellion, all while relentlessly preparing for a naval invasion from his totally impoverished state in the capital. But getting him off the bench and back onto the chessboard, that required some intense bureaucratic maneuvering. Step 1, Governor Yao Qisheng, who intimately knew exactly what Shi Lang was capable of, guaranteed Shi Lang's competence to the emperor by betting the lives of his own 100-plus family members. That is serious confidence. Step 2. In the 20th year of Kangxi, a trusted official and Ansi local named Li Guangdi returned to the capital. He managed to convince Emperor Kangxi with one incredibly powerful argument. The Zheng troops fear Shi Lang above all others. If you want to strike terror into the enemy, he is your man. And that leads us to our final part, Section 5, securing the absolute authority. So in August of Kangxi 20, the 60-year-old Shi Lang is finally appointed. He heads back down to Fujian, straps his armor back on, and gets to work rebuilding a navy that can actually cross the strait. But before the fleet could even set sail, there was one final, super tense, bureaucratic battle to settle back at headquarters. And this brilliantly illustrates the clashing egos at play here. You have Shi Lang, who demanded absolute sole command to attack Taiwan, firmly believing that divided leadership would lead to a disaster. On the other side, you have Governor Yao Qisheng, the guy who stuck his neck out for him, who wanted shared frontline command. After endless arguments that actually delayed the entire campaign, Emperor Kangxi finally stepped in and resolved it in October of his 21st year. He gave Shi Lang exactly what he wanted, the absolute authority he demanded for the naval invasion, while relegating Yao Qisheng strictly to logistics and supply chain management. So, with absolute command finally resting entirely in Shi Lang's hands, how would this 30-year deadlock finally break? We've seen the board meticulously set, the pieces strategically moved, and the leaders perfectly positioned for the final strike. I'm going to leave you with that provocative thought to ponder. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you next time.